Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of the Mighty York podcast. And we've got something great today, a great interview episode. But as you know, the Mighty York podcast is where we uncover the stories and history that make Toronto the vibrant city it is today. Toronto is celebrated as one of the most multicultural cities in the world, but its journey to this point is layered with challenges, resilience, and triumphs. Few communities exemplify this journey more profoundly than Toronto's Chinese population. The story of Chinese Canadians in Toronto began modestly with Sam Ching, the first officially recorded Chinese resident, opening a laundry at 9 Adelaide Street East in 1878. However, the roots of this community extend far beyond that first record, shaped by waves of immigration during the gold rush of 1858, the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, and years of exclusionary policies like the head tax and the Chinese Immigration Act. These early Chinese Torontonians faced systematic discrimination, yet their resilience laid the foundation for the rich cultural contributions we see today, from vibrant Chinatowns to lasting culinary and entrepreneurial legacies. To help us dive into this incredible story, we're honored to have Arlene Chan with us today. Arlene is an author, historian, and storyteller who has spent much of her life documenting and preserving the stories of Toronto's Chinese community. She grew up in Chinatown, and her deep personal and familial connections to its history make her insights invaluable. Through her books and public talks, she's become a leading voice in ensuring this history is celebrated and remembered. So, luckily for us, we're here with Arlene Chan, and she is going to first introduce herself and then add some crucial information to the story. Thank you, Arlene, for being with us.
I'm delighted, and I'm just so thrilled to be here to share stories of my memories of growing up in Toronto's Chinatown. And as an adult writing, I published now several books on the history of Chinatown and the history of the Chinese in Toronto and in Canada. And whenever I do my talks and presentations, I always incorporate my own family stories because I grew up here, and it means a lot to me that people are interested in learning about our history.
So if we look at it on paper, the first official confirmed Chinese resident of Toronto was Sam Ching, I believe in 1878. But let's take a step back. How did we get to that spot? How did Mr. Ching, and one imagines there were probably a few others before him, first get to the city of Toronto?
Yes, it's a really good point about Sam Ching, who's the first recorded Chinese in our city directory for Toronto. I know that there are records, if you read newspapers and go back even before 1878, there is mention of some Chinese people, but the first official person is Sam Ching, who had a laundry at 9 Adelaide Street East. And there is, if you go down to that area, because it's all changed since he was here in 1878, there is a laneway there called Ching Lane. So if you come across it, it's named after Sam Ching. So of course, before Sam Ching arrived, and we really don't know anything about Sam Ching because he only is recorded for 1 year in the city directory, and then he totally disappears. And it's not surprising at all because Sam is probably not even his name, but in those early years, people that were doing the census and doing enumeration, they were definitely not Chinese-speaking people. So they would have sometimes hear a name and say, oh, I'm going to call him Sam. So that's why in our early city directory, there's so many Chinese people with the name Sam, because it was just an easier way for the enumerators to record names. So, of course, our history goes right back to the gold rush years, and up until the end of the 1800s, almost like 100% of all the Chinese who were living in Canada were living in British Columbia. So for the gold rush in 1858, that's when we had our first major influx of Chinese coming into Canada. And Canada wasn't even Canada at that point. They were landing on the colony of British Columbia. And that is why Canada, and even any place where the Chinese overseas landed, they call it Gold Mountain. And it started in the United States with their gold rush, which preceded our 1858 gold rush. And so Canada came to be known as Gold Mountain. And so for those early thousands that came hoping to become rich, whenever we talk about immigration, we say, what were the push factors? What were the pull factors? So definitely the first major pull factor was the gold rush. And the push factors, it was most of the Chinese who came in those early years came from the south part of China, the Guangdong province. And if you look at that province in 1850s to the end of the 1800s, a lot of natural disasters like earthquakes and typhoons and flooding. And then sometimes there was too much rain and sometimes there wasn't enough rain, so there was drought. And there was only enough food to feed 1/3 of the population in Guangdong province. And add on top of that, civil wars and high taxes. So when this word started reaching the villages that there was this far away place where if you went there, you would get rich because there was gold. So that was the first influx of Chinese coming. And the second major one was for the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. So we're talking again about the late 1800s, and Canada, after Confederation, 1867, it was all located on the east side of Canada. And so British Columbia, being a colony of the Dominion of the British Empire, was being courted not only by Canada to join Canada, but also being courted by the United States to join United States. And I can't even imagine our country without having British Columbia at the other end. But so Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister, said to British Columbia, if you join, then we'll build a transcontinental railway. So Canada is going to be connected from coast to coast. So British Columbia will be able to be connected with the rest of Canada. So that was a promise made. But in those early years, there was not the population, the male population, to support the construction of such a huge engineering project. And so the person that was hired to work on the construction of the railway, Andrew Onderdonk, had a lot of experience from the United States, building the railroads down there, and said, if you hire Chinese workers, you'll get the work done and you don't even have to pay the Chinese workers as much money. So that's what happened. And over 15,000 laborers came over from China, over the Pacific Ocean, landed in British Columbia. And so from 1881 until 1885, we're involved with building that western portion of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And that was completed in 1885. I don't know if you can recall in your memory a very famous photograph called The Driving of the Last Spike. And if I can think of one picture that talks about Canada as a nation from coast to coast, from sea to sea, it's that picture. And that's the driving of the last spike that connected British Columbia, the CPR there, with the rest of the CPR. And now Canada, you could travel from coast to coast on this transcontinental railway. So of course, when that was finished, the government said, we don't want any more Chinese coming into Canada. And so they introduced what we call the Chinese Immigration Act. It said any more Chinese who want to come here have to pay a head tax. And it started off at $50. So it was the intention not to bring any more Chinese into Canada, but even more restrictive was we don't want the Chinese already in Canada, these railroad workers, to start bringing over their wives and their families, their children. We don't want the Chinese to establish a community here. So that head tax was established in 1885, and the Chinese still kept coming because of those push factors. So the head tax was doubled to $100, and then eventually it was $500. And that was a lot of money because in those days that was worth, that was 2 years of salaries, or you could have purchased a couple of houses in Vancouver with $500. But still the Chinese kept coming because of that push factor. So in 1923, on July 1st, the government introduced the Exclusion Act. It's still called the Chinese Immigration Act, but now it was an exclusionary law. No more Chinese were allowed to come in for 24 years until 1947. So that's why we have such a slow trickle of Chinese coming into Canada. They had to come in, of course, crossing the Pacific Ocean, and they would have had to come in from British Columbia And until that transcontinental railway was completed, they wouldn't have been able to come into Toronto. So that's the short part of telling how is it that the Chinese started coming into Toronto.
So, for those Chinese who were already in Canada, do we have any sense of why they would have come to Toronto?
Well, they wanted to come to Toronto because things were so bad in British Columbia. They wanted to stay in Canada because things were so bad in China that even though they were not paid very well and they had to take very low paying jobs, it was still much better in Canada than if they had stayed in China. They were at least able to earn some money to send back to their families in China. So as soon as that railway was finished, this was a way for them to leave British Columbia because you have to remember that up until the First World War, there were over 100 anti-Chinese policies and laws in place. Chinese were not allowed to vote. They couldn't run for election. They couldn't go into professions like law and medicine. They couldn't swim in public swimming pools. If they went to see go to the theater, they had to sit in a segregated section. So again, over 100 anti-Chinese policies and laws in place. So the Chinese started traveling on that transcontinental railway to try to find a more welcoming place than British Columbia. And that's why all along the railway tracks, there are Chinese laundries and Chinese restaurants and cafes all along the railway. And so they came into Toronto looking for, again, a better place. And they saw it as a place where they had opportunities to start a small business or to find a job.
So, where in Toronto would they have first settled?
Yeah, where would they have settled when they first arrived here? Arriving at Union Station and not having access to any public transit in those early years, they settled as close as possible to Union Station. So the early groupings of Chinese businesses and homes, there was one little grouping on George Street, which is not that far from Union Station out in the East End. And then the second grouping was on York Street, which is just directly that runs north-south from Union Station. But each time there was development that pushed them away. So on York Street, there were a lot of homes there. And then, as you know, York Street is now all high rises. And then the Chinese were moved along to Queen Street. And again, they got pushed out of Queen Street. And then they ended up settling on Elizabeth Street. And in those years when they arrived here, that was St. John's Ward, which became known as the Ward. And by the time the Chinese started arriving and settling in the Ward, which was an affordable area for them, it was a very rundown part of the city, even though it was a major settlement area for all people the immigrants who were coming into Toronto. And so the Chinese were probably the last major immigrant group to settle in the Ward. And so again, that's close to Union Station. So that's why the Chinese settled downtown, close to the train station. And that's why all of our Chinatowns all across Canada are close to the train stations. And they're now in the downtown area, which is nowadays, as you know, very valuable real estate. And the developers really have their eye on redeveloping Chinatowns, not only in Toronto, but right across Canada, right across North America.
Now, you mentioned St. John's Ward, which was more commonly known as just the Ward, which had been the first arrival neighborhood for immigrants for decades. So, for these Chinese arriving, say around the turn of the 20th century, what would life have been like in the Ward?
Well, the Ward was, when the St. John's Ward first established, was Irish and Irish and English settlers that lived there. There was the homes that were built, they were 1 and 2 story buildings. And they were, very, very, it was a very nice residential area. But then we had successive waves coming in, Italians and the Jews that were fleeing from Europe, settling. And so by the time the Chinese moved in, the neighborhood it was like old. It was getting really run down. And the single family homes had all become like rooming houses. And then instead of having like one family in one room, you'd have many, many families or many people living in one room. So, and it's interesting because the group that was before the Chinese moving in was a Jewish community. And so when the Jewish community, they moved out to Spadina to the Kensington market area, the Chinese moved into the ward. And then when the Chinese were forced to move out of the ward and they moved over to Spadina, the Jewish community there was moving north. And that's when the Chinese moved into the Spadina Dundas area. But because the ward was a long established neighborhood and it was getting quite run down, the Chinese moved into existing buildings and businesses. So there was a long time when there was an overlap. So it was not unusual that the Chinese businesses were working side by side with the Jewish businesses. And even when I think of on Elizabeth Street, there's one man who Chinese Canadian who was living in Chinatown, and his mother used to send him to Elizabeth Street to buy a live chicken. And there were two live poultry stores on Elizabeth Street, and they were brothers, Jewish brothers who owned the businesses. And this man recalled when he went with his money in hand to buy a live chicken that the two brothers would be trying to pull him on this young boy. No, buy the chicken for me. No, buy the chicken for me. So anyhow, it just shows you the close relationship between the Chinese and the Jewish communities because there was such an overlap. And because the Jewish community shared a lot of the same negative and discriminatory experiences as the Chinese, there's always been a strong bond between the two communities.
Very nice. Can you talk a little bit about the Bachelor Society and what that was like in the Chinese community? Because some of the research I did explained about how a lot of these men obviously were here alone working to send money back. So it created a society with limited women in that society. So I was just wondering if you could speak on that a little bit.
Yes, the Bachelor Society was named that because this was something that was very, very typical of the early Chinese communities all across Canada and also going down to the United States. It was because of in Canada, the head tax, again, that levied that $50, $100, then $500 tax on anybody coming into Canada. And then the Exclusion Act from 1923 to 1947 meant that no one could come into Canada. So what we had was a large Chinese population that was predominantly male. And even though they were called so-called bachelors, most of them were actually married and they were sending their money back to their families in China. So the term bachelor was used because they lived like single men, and they would work their long hours. I'm talking about 6 or 7 days and 15, 16, 17 hours a day in laundries and restaurants and cafes. And then they would not have any family to go back to at the end of the day. And they would not have any family to celebrate holidays and any, Chinese New Year or things like that. And I just want to bring in the story about my mom, who was born in Nanaimo, British Columbia. And she came from a family of 12. And because Vancouver had a larger population, and my grandfather, when he came in 1899 and landed in Vancouver or British Columbia, he was one of the few Chinese men who was able to afford the head tax because he came first, worked a bit, and then brought over his wife, who's my grandmother. And so they had a family of 12 children. And so when my mother had to leave British Columbia to come to Toronto to work, and this was during the Great Depression, she came here to work. And so when she arrived in Toronto, landing at Union Station and coming into Chinatown, she saw this bachelor society, all these men who were just on their own. And at that time, up until Second World War, there were only about a dozen Chinese families in Chinatown. I mean, I can't even imagine just a dozen Chinese families. So this really struck my mother because coming from such a large, warm, loving family, and then coming to Toronto and seeing all these lonely men, this is something that really struck her and really formed her direction of where she went working in the community as she grew into adulthood. So this bachelor society, because it was a bachelor society, because there were no settlement services from the government in those early years, the Chinese that were here really turned to their associations. And these associations, some of them are based on your surname. So if you had the same surname, if you're a Wong or if you're a Lum, you would join your Wong Family Association or your Lum Family Association. Or you could join a locality association, meaning you came from the same part of China. And these associations provided help if you needed to find a place to live, if you needed to find a job, if you wanted to borrow money to start up a business, because banks would not loan money to the Chinese in those early years. This is where you went to. You went to your family associations, which I look at as being the foundation of our early Chinese community. So this bachelor society, they would have been able to go to their associations in the absence of their own families to celebrate New Year's, to go to a place to socialize, to have a group of people who would speak the same language. So these were very, very important, especially in those bachelor society years.
How did the rest of Toronto see Chinatown and the Chinese community?
So how Toronto viewed Chinatown, and again, because Chinatown was in the ward, which was did not have a good reputation by the time the Chinese community moved in, really did not look at the Chinese people very favorably. And in fact, they did not dare venture into Chinatown because it had a bad reputation for doing like all kinds of things which was just the media misrepresenting the Chinese in Toronto. And so it was, that's why after World War II, which was a turning point in our Chinese history, that because of the contribution of the Chinese Canadians during World War II, not only serving and enlisting in our armed forces, but also raising millions of dollars in the victory funds and fundraising initiatives, that the World War II, we saw the end of the Exclusion Act. We saw that the Chinese got the right to vote, run into politics, go into professions like law and medicine after World War II, right across Canada. So this was significant. But I always say that you can repeal laws, you can change laws, you can make sure that all the discriminatory laws against Chinese are gone. But the hardest thing to change are people's perceptions, people's ideas, their attitudes about people. And so what happened after the war is that there was the opening of several restaurants, which we now call the Big Four restaurants in our Chinatown at Elizabeth and Dundas Street. And these Big Four restaurants were Kwong Chow Restaurant, which was my parents' restaurant, the Sai Wu Restaurant, Lychee Garden, and Nanking Restaurant. And I can't emphasize enough, and people make fun of it today, but in those early years, Chinese Canadian food was what was served at these Big Four restaurants. And Chinese Canadian food was really Chinese food adapted for the Western palate. So this is what attracted people to start coming into Chinatown, these Big Four restaurants, which were not your typical pre-World War II restaurants that you would have found in Chinatown, which would have been maybe a half a dozen tables. These Big Four restaurants had seating for 200-300 people, white tablecloths. Lychee Garden had a doorman and a live band that played and entertainment. So it really, these Big Four restaurants, because people really love Chinese Canadian dishes like chop suey and egg rolls and fortune cookies, which of course, fortune cookies are not really Chinese, but we still serve them today. These dishes and these restaurants, because they were so appealing, really turned people's ideas because they started flocking into Chinatown to eat Chinese Canadian food. And of course, politicians, famous people, I'm just thinking of my own parents' restaurant, the Kwong Chow Restaurant, where there's, we had prime ministers would be eating there, members of parliament, city councillors, again, because of its proximity to City Hall and the Ontario government building. And this would be recorded and reported on by the media, and with pictures of politicians and famous people eating at these restaurants, Chinatown now became a destination. And I remember my parents' restaurant was on the second floor And there were lineups because I had to work at the restaurant. There's 6 kids in our family. We all had to work at the restaurant on the weekends. And there would be a lineup going down the stairs all the way out the front door. People were waiting for an hour and a half to get a table. And this was very typical at Saiwu restaurant at Lychee Garden as well.
It's probably helpful to remind people or tell them, because many people may not know, that this was a time when Toronto was incredibly parochial. Uh, More recent people are just kind of used to the multicultural Toronto. Jewish or Italian or Chinese food would have been unfathomably exotic.
Yes, it's a really good point because, when people think of things today, it's through a very narrow set of blinkers. And that's why I really like going out and telling the stories and sharing stories about our history, because what we have today was not always what we had. And so I never take anything for granted. Like, for example, I never miss an election because again, as I mentioned, the Chinese did not get the right to vote until after Second World War. So this is not something we've always had. So when you go to Chinatown today and you see diversity of restaurants and businesses there and all the different Chinese food that you get there, this is not what was typical in the early years. And as you said, it was very, and I'm going to use this phrase, but before Second World War, before all the repeal of the anti-Chinese laws and policies, it was called a white Canada. And the slogan was White Canada Forever. And this carried over into Toronto, of course. And Toronto, of course, was closed every Sunday because it was Toronto the Good. So when you look at how things have changed from those early years, including what kind of cuisine that you could get if you wanted to go out and something to eat, it's so different. And with the Chinese Canadian restaurants, with the Big Four, that's when we started seeing more and more diversity and choice of where we could go out and eat.
So, what was the situation after the war? The immigration laws had been loosened, but Chinatown itself was changing, not entirely by choice.
So after Second World War, it was wonderful, all the things that were improving with the repeal of the Exclusion Act, and the Chinese got the rights to have full citizenship rights after the war. But what was happening at the same time in Toronto was the city's plan to build a new city hall in Public Square. And so in 1947, which is when the Chinese Immigration Act, the exclusionary law, was repealed, that was the year that the city of Toronto decided that they wanted to build a new city hall and they wanted to expropriate land in what was the ward. And so what this meant was the 2/3 of our original Chinatown the land was expropriated to make way for the construction of new city hall and the public square. And so the expropriation took place in the 50s. Construction of new city hall started in the early 60s. And by 1965, new city hall was officially opened. And what happened in 1965 is that the city said, well, I think we should get rid of what's left of Chinatown because it's still in the ward and it's still very run down. And at this time, the Chinese community rallied and fought back. And you have to remember that now we have community consultation. When the city wants to do a grand public works project, there is public consultation. But in those early years, there was no consultation with the Chinese community when they expropriated the original 2/3 of our Chinatown. But the second time around, the Chinese community rallied, and this would have been under the leadership of my mother, Jean Lum, and she headed up the Save Chinatown campaign. And fortunately, there was just a much synchronicity happening because at City Hall, there were reform politicians who were coming into power. So we're talking about people like David Crombie and William Kilbourne, who were looking at the city differently from the earlier city politicians. And we're also talking about the time when people like Jane Jacobs were paying attention to what was happening in the city. And this was the idea that let's tear down the old and replace it with the new. And so a lot of neighborhoods including the ward, were being destroyed for these new developments. So 1965, we saw the establishment of the Save Chinatown campaign. And fortunately, they were able to save what was left of our first Chinatown. So that was good. But in the meantime, the Chinese community, because most of them had the businesses and the residents have been demolished, they had to move somewhere else. They couldn't go south, they couldn't go east, they couldn't go north. So they went west. They went westward along Dundas Street, and they went towards Dundas and Spadina area. And as I mentioned earlier, the Jewish community was moving north. And so the Chinese community took over a lot of the homes and the businesses that were in the Dundas and Spadina area. And that's how we have our second Chinatown, which we call Chinatown West. And it was a very slow development because my family home was at Beverly and Dundas Street, which is really sort of halfway between our first Chinatown and then at the other end is our new Chinatown. And when our family moved there in the at the end of the 50s, it was very residential. So you could have walked from like Art Gallery was on the one side of Dundas, and then if you just kept walking on Dundas towards Spadina, all the way there, it would have been all residential homes, with the exception of a few Japanese businesses. And so, and when we moved there, it was largely residential. But by the time we moved out in the 70s, most of those residential homes had been converted into storefronts for businesses, small businesses. So even I lead a lot of Chinatown tours. And so when I lead them through tours and I'm pointing out our history, I always say, don't just look at the street level, look up onto the second floor, because a lot of the buildings, when you look at them, you can still see the roofs of the homes that used to be there. So it's very, very interesting how that our community evolved from being residential into a commercial residential area. Like the homes are still on the south of Dundas Street and north of Dundas Street, but just all along Dundas Street, all the homes have been replaced by businesses. And so our family home is still there. It's called the Big Red House. I have a funny story. I was at a Chinese banquet, and I don't know if you've ever been to one before, but there are hundreds of people that go, and you're sitting at tables of 10. So they're very, very noisy, lively events. And so I was sitting at a table of 10, and I could only talk to the people on either side of me because it is so noisy at these Chinese banquets. And so after the banquet was over, I went over to the other side, and I was talking to this young man, and I said, "Oh, I'm just introducing myself. We didn't get a chance to talk." And it turns out he said, "Well, I grew up in Chinatown." And I just lit up and I said, "Oh, I grew up in Chinatown as well." And so he told me where he lived. And I said, "Yes, I lived on Dundas Street too, at corner of Beverly and Dundas." He said, "The Big Red House?" And I said, "Yes, the Big Red House." And so he told me that he went trick or treating because we just celebrated Halloween. And he said he went trick or treating. And at the end of the day, he went back home and he had to empty his loot bag on the table so his mother could look at everything that he had collected on his route. And so she saw this package because my mother, we would all be the day before Halloween, we would make these packages with an apple, with those pumpkin, the Halloween kiss candies, and wrap it with clear cellophane wrap with a ribbon and a sucker in the top. It was a very attractive parcel. We made over 150 of them in those early years. And he said, so he empties out his contents, and then the mother points at that bag and says, "Where did you get that?" And he said, "Oh, the Big Red House." And then his mother says, "Oh, that's okay." Because they knew that my parents, they knew who lived in the Big Red House. So it was a great story for him to share with me.
That was a great story. I
It
was
was a
going to
good
add,
story.
going back a couple of minutes, for those who are trying to think of what was left of the old Chinatown that your mother saved, today's probably better known to the Japanese community. So, the more things change. Now, during the 60s and 70s, immigration patterns began to change, and you had a significant influx of Chinese speaking people who may not have come from the same region or had the same background as the Chinese who were already here. How did that affect the
Well,
community?
the repeal was 1947, but it still took another 20 years until 1967 before all the clauses in the immigration law that were discriminating against the Chinese were removed. And what I mean is like, yes, Chinese can now come into Canada, but you can only bring your children if they're under age 18, or you can only bring your parents here if they're over a certain. So there were all these ifs and ands or buts. So it took another 20 years. And my mother was very involved in helping to ease the immigration laws because we're talking about family reunification. All these bachelor society men wanting to bring over their families here to Canada. So 1967, the Canadian government revamped the immigration law and introduced the point system. So you were eligible to come based on points. What does Canada need? We want people who can speak English or French. We want a certain skill. So the Chinese in 1967 were allowed to apply on equal footing with immigrants coming from other parts of the world. So we started seeing a huge influx coming in from Hong Kong. And at one point, Hong Kong was the largest source of immigrants coming into Canada. And then, of course, later on, it was China became the largest source of immigrants coming into Canada. And this really, really changed the whole Chinese community, the profile of our Chinese community. So going back to those early years, when I talked about where the first groupings of Chinese came, they came from the southern part of China, from Guangdong province. But with the immigrants coming in after World War II from Hong Kong, they were people who were used to living in the city. They spoke Cantonese, whereas the earlier immigrants spoke a dialect of Cantonese. They spoke Taishanese. So the immigrants coming from Hong Kong spoke Cantonese. And they were used to city life, and they were brought with them the sophisticated dishes that were coming in from Hong Kong. And then with the immigrants coming in from China, not only from the southern part of China, but from the north, the west, the east, bringing in different languages, and eventually Mandarin became the most spoken language in Chinatown. So you can see this transition from Taishanese to Cantonese to the Mandarin language. And now the Chinese language is the most spoken language after our non-official languages. So this is not only in Toronto, but right across Canada. So we're talking about thousands that have come in. And again, because of the diversity, and we had not only people coming from Hong Kong and from China, which were the largest sources of people coming into Canada for many, many years. But after the war in Vietnam ended in 1975, and as you might remember, Canada welcomed Vietnamese refugees with that very generous refugee program. And so many of the Vietnamese refugees who came were Chinese, ethnic Chinese. And that's why in Chinatown, there are a lot of Vietnamese restaurants there. Then there were also many coming in from Taiwan, coming in from Singapore. So our Chinese community now, we started off with that one man, Sam Ching, in 1878, who was in our city directory. Now in the greater Toronto area, we have over 700,000 Chinese Canadians. And this is such a diverse group, bringing diverse cultures, traditions, food, especially, because if you go into Chinatown, you don't just see Cantonese food. You see food from Sichuan, northern dumplings, the hand-pulled noodles. It's amazing. And the hot pots, all these dishes, bringing the variety of food into our Chinatown. So our Chinese community now is not only large, it's not only now moved out of Chinatown and out into Scarborough and into Markham and Richmond Hill, is so diverse and reaching all parts of the city and participating in all walks of life. So really a radical change from those early years.
Now, as one last question, and I will let you decide how you want to answer it, which is a memory of the old Chinatown. And that could be a memory of yours, or maybe a story your mother told you, something, a person, a place, an institution, something that's just been lost to the passage of time, a memory of the old days.
Yeah, when I was growing up in Chinatown, there weren't too many Chinese families in those early years. And by the time we moved out in the 70s, there were a lot more Chinese living there. And I went to Ogden School there, and then I went to Ryerson, which is all in that area there. And I used to work at, I mentioned earlier, I used to work at my parents' restaurant, the Kwang Chow restaurant. And so one of my duties was to answer the phone and take takeout orders. And the most frequent comment I ever got was, "You speak such good English," on the phone when I was taking the orders. And I always had to bite my tongue because I wanted to say something rude, but then I couldn't. It's just because it happens so frequently. "Oh, you speak such good English," um, that I just found it very funny, and I just kind of bit my tongue in wanting to say, "My grandfather came in 1899, so we've been here for a very long time." But it was just, I I just find it amazing that people judge somebody by the way they talk, by the way they look, and not really seeing a person as a person, but they're just judging it based on physical traits or the way I speak. And so I just think that as we live in Toronto and it becomes more and more diverse, that some of the stories that I experienced when I was growing up and being a Chinese person first growing up, we grew up first in the Junction, which there were no Chinese living out in Keele and Dundas area. And then when we moved to Chinatown in the late 50s, it became more and more that I was living among Chinese people, Chinese Canadian people. But I just like to, just because we live in Toronto, which is regarded as um, probably the most diverse city in the world, is that we have to learn, and it's baby steps forward, and sometimes we go backwards, but baby steps forward, that we really have to, when we meet people, get to know them as a person and not judge them by how they look or how they sound. So this is something that I remember. This is something that meant a lot to me as a kid growing up in Chinatown.
So we'll wrap it up there. We'd like to thank Arlene Chan for appearing. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention? Maybe a tour that's upcoming?
I'm on hold with my tours in Chinatown. I just recently had hip replacement surgery, so eventually I hope to get back into doing my tours of Chinatown, but I still am going out. I was using my cane for a while, but now I don't have to use my cane, but I'm still going out and speaking to groups of people. I'm going to a synagogue next week, and I love that I'm going to a synagogue because we share stories, and people remember growing up, their memories of growing up in the ward and going to Chinatown and going to Kensington Market, and the live poultry and chickens that you used to buy. They used to be in cages. Like, people would remember that. So when I share these stories, and then it really engages. And again, it just shows these intersections of how much we share, the common experiences of growing up in Toronto. And it's so I feel so privileged and honored to be sharing our stories, telling more and more people about our history, because I didn't learn this in school, and it's just something that I like telling people about. And people get excited when they hear the stories of how our city has developed over the years.
Guys, thank you so much for sticking around, and thank you so much to Arlene for such great stories and a great representation of her community. That's it for the episode, and that's it for us for the holiday season for a while, guys. So stay tuned. Adam, you got any messages?
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to all. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can get us at muddy_York@outlook.com, and we'll see you in 2025. Thanks for listening.